Welcome to the February 24th, 2025 episode of the Energy Show. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop, and I'm joined today by Energy Show producer MC Breadner.
Everyone.
MC, we're going to be talking again about Trump tariffs and the reason, particularly oil tariffs, not manufacturing tariffs, not natural gas tariffs, but oil tariffs. And one of the reasons is because we're starting to get some information filtering in from the US about what American refiners are thinking about Canadian heavy crude and the impact of the tariffs. And so, what we're going to do in this show is we're going to break it into two parts. The first part will lay out the argument. I got a three-part argument for why Canadian leadership is not is where our leaders are performing poorly. The options, the strategies that they're not talking about, or the options we're being given, the Canadian public is being given, are very limited and they're very kind of status quo. And so we think we're arguing that there's a dearth of leadership. Somebody needs to stand up with a plan, with a strategy, start a parade and get this moving, get the public support behind it so we can respond adequately to Trump. So that's the argument. And then we're going to show the second part, we're going to show our math. Because what I've been doing is going and reading transcripts from earnings calls that have been taking place in the last week or two from American refining companies. And the analysts that come on these calls, all of them are interested in how the company intends to respond to the tariffs, and 10% on Canadian oil, 25% on Mexican oil for similar heavy grades of oil. And so we'll talk about that, basically show our math. And there's lots more math to come, by the way, but this is what we've got so far. So that's it's going to be a busy half hour or 45 minutes, whatever it turns out to be. So the first one, now you've joined me for a number of episodes, and we've interviewed Dr. Chris Bataille, who's an energy economist, and he
hmm
talked about the highly integrated industry, oil and gas industry between the US and Canada. It's been like that for 50, 60 years. It was designed like that. We send them raw crude and raw gas. They turn it into gasoline, diesel, what have you. And we've also had Kevin Byrne, who's an energy economist with S&P Global. I've interviewed him for the better part of 10 years, knows the oil sands really well. And we've talked about some of the options here. One of the things, my takeaways from looking at these transcripts is that our assumptions maybe are not as accurate as we thought they were, because it's been a truism that there's 5.5 million barrels a day of heavy crude refining capacity in the U.S. Most of it is in the Midwest around Chicago and Detroit, and then some of it is down in the U.S. Gulf Coast in around Houston. There's also some out in California, and there's a little bit on the Northeast coast. So we've assumed that the $100 billion or so that these companies have spent over the last 30, 40 years so that they could do the extra processing required to turn heavy crude into gasoline or diesel fuel or bunker C or whatever it was, that would prevent them, because they had configured for heavy in their refineries, they couldn't switch and configure for light. And
Right.
I think we've kind of that assumption is not holding up, is I guess my point here. So what we've done, uh, in the way it turns out, it looks like the some process like refiners like Marathon Petroleum, which is a big one in the Midwest, it says no, we actually are well configured. We can switch from the Canadian heavy over to the U.S. light sweet crude that comes out of the shale basins, and we can do that. And it could be as much as maybe 400,000 or 500,000 barrels a day just with Marathon. But then there are other refiners who don't have that, and they're kind of like a captured market. And so once they become very dependent on Canadian heavy crude, and they can't switch, or they can't. It would be a very high cost for them to switch. So the question
hmm
then becomes, who's going to pay? And I'll show this a little bit more in more detail when we get to the PowerPoint slides. But basically, Marathon says it'll be mostly the Canadian producers that'll pay that 10%. And there's another fellow, Matt Lucy, who's the CEO of PFB Energy, which is a smaller refiner, and he says no, that's probably it'll be the consumers that'll mostly pay. And and then we've got energy economist Chris Bataille, who says it'll likely be split a third, and a third between the producers, the refiners, and the consumers. And the reason I bring all of these up is, first of all, there's different circumstances. It'll be different depending on the refining, the market. But the big thing is how confusing it is. You have no idea.
Mhm.
Like everybody talks about how, look, we're talking to the administration, we're talking to our trade associations, our lawyers are talking. We don't know. We don't know how. When did Trump say March 4th? Is that when he's going to announce?
March 1st, which is actually Saturday, so I'm not sure, but it'll
Oh,
happen on
I
Saturday.
thought I read March 1st. And then today, I just as before we came on, I read a headline that said that he wasn't going to back down. So it didn't matter that we were going to be spending $1.3 billion on beefing up our border security to keep fentanyl and
Yeah,
illegal immigrants out of the United States. That makes absolutely no difference. So really what this is all about has become pretty plain is it's power play to pressure Canada, he's going to squeeze us, squeeze our economy until we say uncle and then we become the 51st state. Boy, I can tell you, I was looking around at some of the polling data. Have you seen this? Like Angus
it's
wrote, Reid, 90% of Canadians say absolutely not. We don't want to be the 51st state. I mean, what are you hearing in the social media circles?
yeah. I mean, if anything, I think this is bringing Canadians together. It's something that we can all unify against. We don't want to be the 51st state. I mean, there was a joke last week just saying, the one thing that brings all Canadians together is we're proud not to be American. So, I mean, I think yeah, I think most people are definitely against it.
Now, see, this is interesting because if we're all united then. I think this is probably in my experience, this might be the most we've ever seen Canadians united
Yes.
around anything. We don't like Trump. We don't want to be the 51st state. We see what he's doing to us. Everybody's paying attention to this issue. What are we going to do? That's the
Yeah.
question. What is our strategy? And this is our central argument, a central part of this argument is that our leaders are providing they're providing poor leadership. You know,
Yeah.
because one of the things I've learned over the years is you have a strategy and you maybe have some policy that you want to propose, but boy, you had better do your politics to make sure that you have a constituency that supports
Hmm.
that policy. Because if you just spring it on people without, building the support first, not going to fly. Or if you introduce a policy and look at what happened in Alberta with the Liberals, the oil and gas emissions cap, the clean electricity regulations, the clean fuel standard, on and on. It was like for the last 4 years, the Liberals bring in these arguably good policies and then do nothing to sell them.
Yeah.
And no surprise then, pushback from Alberta from Premier Danielle Smith, and she, I think, is kind of winning the day on this. She's kept them at bay so far, and which is a point of her strategy. And
Yeah.
it points to the lesson we should draw for this issue is that whatever the strategy is going to be, the Team Canada approach to it is that we have to be united and we have to have a strategy. And then we have to get everybody together to implement that strategy. And I would say on the oil front, here's what here's some of the responses. I think the leading kinds of approaches to this. So the most disturbing one is the idea that we need to build more pipelines. Now,
Yeah.
the issue here is that Trump's going to announce on Saturday, or maybe it'll be on Monday, that we're going to have these new, 10% tariff on Canadian oil. And the refiners are saying, the ones that I read, were saying, probably about 30 days it'll take for that pricier oil to kind of work its way into the system, and we'll start to see an effect on our business, maybe on the prices we have to charge in local markets like Ohio or Wisconsin or whatever. How long does it take to build a pipeline? Do you know how long it takes to build a pipeline?
5 to 10 years.
5 to 10 years. And the federal government has said we'll fast track this, we'll facilitate it. And there have been some First Nation chiefs who have said, well, we'll help, because Aboriginal consultation is Section 35 of the Constitution. You
Mm.
don't get to do a project like this without consulting Aboriginal communities. End of story. The TMX showed us that the courts will shut that down. Okay.
Yeah.
So even if you did all of that, you still have to get it through the environmental review process, get all of, do all the work, and then you have to build the darn thing. So 5 years, if you're going to build Energy East out to the East Coast, or you're going to build Northern Gateway out to Kitimat, or now we're even hearing, that the Trans Mountain expansion, which the government owns, by the way, was designed so a northern leg could be built up to Kitimat, which has a deep water port, and there would have to be all kinds of changes because right now marine traffic is banned off, or oil tanker traffic is banned off the northern part of the British Columbia coast. So it's not simple, but it could be done if there was political consensus. But it's like the oil and gas industry, all of their big narrative machine, their political machine, and all of a sudden, as there's a tsunami of social media and news media and announcements and proclamations, and it just we're swamped. Got to build pipelines. Got to build pipelines. And why you would take 5 to 10 years to build an infrastructure for a problem that's going to show up on your doorstep 30 days from now is utterly bizarre. And
And hopefully be over in 4 years when Trump leaves too.
you might not even the pipeline might not even be in service by the time a new president comes along and reverses Trump's. I mean, we don't know, right? It's a
Yeah.
roll of the dice, but that means it's risky. So
Yeah.
why are we promoting a very risky policy when there might be other approaches to this? We're not even
Yeah.
talking about other approaches. Okay, so that's the first thing. Is the second thing is premiers like Danielle Smith in Alberta and Scott Moe in Saskatchewan, they are the Neville Chamberlains. And for any of you kids who aren't into history, Neville Chamberlain was the UK prime minister who went to went to Munich in 1938 and did the deal with Hitler, and so that there would be a non-aggression pact and peace in our time, he said. Well, less than a year later, Hitler invaded Poland, started World War II, and I don't know how many millions of people were killed in that conflict, millions and millions. But that's what they want us to appease Trump, give him something, give him a win. And guys like Trump are bullies, and you give them something, and they come back for something more. You give them part of your lunch, then they want to come back for the whole lunch. And then they want tomorrow's lunch. And then they want your lunch money for next week. I mean, there's no end to these things. If he's already said that his strategy is to annex Canada as the 51st state because he wants our minerals and our water and our resources, if that's what he wants, then giving him little bits of pieces to try to appease him is not going to work. It's like Hitler wanting Poland, right?
Absolutely.
Wanted
Yeah.
territory, and he wasn't going to stop. And the agreement with Chamberlain was just a delaying tactic to keep. So anyway, that's not an option. Then there's the Canadian political leaders' response. Now you pay more attention to NDP politics than I do. So what has Jagmeet Singh and the rest of the federal NDP, and for those folks who aren't Canadian, that's kind of the left of center Canadian federal political party. So what are you hearing, MC?
Well, I mean, they are concerned about Canadian sovereignty and have come out and said that. They've been, we saw Charlie Angus on CNN. We've seen, I mean, EB has been on Fox News. I know he's the premier of BC, but they are coming out on Team Canada for sure. But I haven't seen a plan come out, or I haven't seen what the response is going to be if those Trumps do come on, in the next 10 days or whatever it is. So yeah, they're definitely, wanting to do something. But it's not clear to me what the plan is.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that the NDP and its predecessor, the CCF, the Canadian Cooperative Commonwealth Party, their success in Canadian politics at the federal level has been they don't form government, but they come forward with these great ideas, with the Canadian
Yeah.
pension system that we owe in healthcare, Medicare, our medical system. All of that started with the NDP, and then the Liberals happened to be in power, and they would co-opt those ideas and implement them. And that's what the NDP were. They were a source of ideas. What the bank, there's no ideas coming out of them now
Yeah.
none that I can see. So their function in the political system, as it's been historically, they're not fulfilling that. It's nice they're on Team Canada. Thank you very much, Jag. We really appreciate that. An idea or two, you know, wouldn't hurt you, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean, we saw him with talking with Bernie Sanders this weekend. I mean, there's lots of things happening and solidarity, definitely, but again, no real plan.
okay, the CPC, Conservative Party of Canada, led by Pierre Poilievre. And the problem here is basically whatever Danielle Smith is saying, Pierre Poilievre is saying essentially the same thing. Now, he has come out after years, basically, of being the undeclared head of Maple MAGA, the sort of the Trump culture
Oh,
wars, that's his political style. He's his entire political strategy is based on beating up Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the Liberals, and all of a sudden now he's kind of stuck because it's somebody that thinks is of his tribe running the U.S. and threatening Canadian sovereignty. So the only thing that Polyev would do is just, I think he said some point, wow, if I was prime minister, there'd be pipelines everywhere,
yeah.
east, west, north. We'd build them everywhere. Well, okay, how is that any different from what Alberta is asking for, what the industry is asking for? So no new ideas coming out of the CPC. But okay, so the Liberals, Prime Minister Trudeau is going to, his resignation takes effect next month. What is it, March 8th that the Liberals have their leadership vote? Mark
7th or
Carney, the
8th, yeah.
former governor of Canada, former governor of England, is the front runner. He's way ahead of Chrystia Freeland, the ex finance minister under Trudeau. And so let's assume just for a moment that Carney wins. I read an excellent essay today that said the problem here is that Carney is a technocrat. He spent a lot of his career in government and advising government and managing the money supply and so on. And technocrats don't like to pull one or two levers in a big way. They like to nudge a lot of levers a little way. So it's the
Hmm.
status quo, and let's just make little adjustments to fix that. And
Yeah.
and I think that, we did a show last week based, looking at his a press release that he put out where it talked about energy policy, and it was pretty bland, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that was our
Hmm.
criticism is where's the beef? Where's the beef?
Yeah.
There's no beef. And at a time when Canada desperately needs all the beef it can get, there's no beef.
Yeah.
So I don't think I would say that essentially, while it's great, we're on the Team Canada more or less, Daniel Smith, but we're basically Team Canada. We don't know what Team Canada is going to do. What's the game plan? Like we wouldn't have gone into the Four Nations hockey tournament without a game plan. We seem to be going into this one without a game plan around oil, which is the focus of today's show. Okay, point number three. What should we do? And we want to make a
Yeah.
contribution here and argue we need a Peter Lougheed. Now, again, for those of you young enough not to remember Peter Lougheed, or those of you who are Canadian and aren't familiar with who he was the Alberta Premier from 1971 to 1986. And he was a progressive conservative, but he said himself, he said, I'm not a conservative. I just want to get stuff done. So in Alberta,
Hmm.
You got to be some variety of some flavor of conservative to get stuff done. So what did he do? Well, he's the one that really kickstarted the development of the oil sands in northern Alberta, which is now the major source of, when we say heavy crude, it's coming out of the oil sands. Without
Yeah.
Lougheed, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So he did that. He created an organization called AOSTRA that developed the steam assisted gravity drainage, which is about half of the oil sands output. He required all ethylene from natural gas to be first offered to Canadian companies, which then led to the development of the Alberta petrochemical industry, which is the second largest petrochemical cluster in all of North America, next to Louisiana and Texas. He created the Alberta Energy Company, Corporation. I mean, on and on. I mean, what he said was, under the Canadian Constitution, the resources, the oil and gas, are owned by Alberta. So they're owned by the people of Alberta. And the industry, the value of those resources should be maximized for the benefit of Alberta. And if Alberta benefits, then the rest of Canada benefits because there are economic spill-offs. The federal government gets a lot of money from taxes because Albertans have the highest income and have the most corporate revenue per capita of any other province. So a prosperous Alberta is in many ways good for the Canadian economy, right?
Correct.
And what has happened since he retired 40 years ago is that we, instead of saying what's the best for the people of Alberta who own the resource owners, we say what's best for the corporations that are exploiting that resource. What's best for Cenovus and CNRL and Imperial Oil and Suncor and Meg Energy? And those are the ones that's what we worry about. And we argue here that what we need is the reincarnation of Peter Lougheed. I'm not talking about a weekend at Bernie's thing, right? We're not going to dig him up. But we need somebody to come forward that has ideas and can say, here's the strategy, folks. We got a short-term strategy because we got to pull some levers, to make sure
Yeah.
that we don't do serious economic damage to the oil industry while we're putting in place a medium-term strategy and a long-term strategy. Well, what's the medium-term strategy? And I should say, short-term strategy. When I'm talking to economists, I think the most sensible thing what came from Chris Bataille, who said, "Look, we may have to have some curtailment." And I don't know if
Hmm.
anybody remembers, but in December of 2018, there had been a leak in the Keystone pipeline, and supply was backing up, and the differential between the Western Canadian Select and the West Texas Intermediate blew out, and it was just a big mess. So the way to solve it was to cut back production by 325,000 barrels a day. Nobody liked it. And there was a big
Hmm.
debate inside the industry about how it should be done. But eventually, Notley said, okay, we're going to curtail it. And that brought supply down. It backed off pressure on the pipeline and markets. And next thing you know, prices went up, and we eventually got back to some kind of normalcy. So if demand falls because the refineries in the Midwest or in the US Gulf Coast can find alternatives to Canadian heavy crude, and we find ourselves in that situation again where we have too much supply and not enough customers, curtailment is what we have to do in the short term.
Right.
There are other options. We've heard, for instance, that 200,000 or 300,000 barrels a day could be optimized, could be added to the Trans Mountain expansion. The government owns that. Like if I was the prime minister, I'd be getting on the horn to the CEO and saying, "Hey, pal, you said that was a 4 or 5 year program to expand that to optimize the pipeline. Can you do it in 4 or 5 days?
Yeah.
Like this is a national
Absolutely.
emergency. We're on a war footing with these clowns." Well, the clown in the White House. Get after it. My friend, that's a saying my friends in Texas. I used to work down in the oil industry a little bit down in West Texas. Get after it. Well, get after it, for crying out loud. Let's get on this thing. That's one thing that could be done. There's also other proposals, about uh, rail shipments of oil up to Churchill, which is way up north, actually where I grew up. Uh, the track goes through permafrost, right? And it's just like a
Right.
roller coaster. So you've got like a 30 mile an hour, 20 mile an hour limit on it, and you can only do it at certain times of the year, whatever. Cobble all those little things together, cobble
Yeah.
them all together and say, okay, how do we, as a government, federal and provincial, how do we facilitate these little things to happen? And we knit together a short-term strategy that will then take the pressure off the industry so that they're still paying royalties and the government of Alberta doesn't go bankrupt because it relies too much on, relied $3 billion last year of
Yeah.
oil and gas revenue went to support the Alberta budget. They won't put in a
Yeah.
sales tax. So, you know, anyway, so that's my point is get the experts together, the smart people, cobble together this little short-term strategy that'll get us over the hump while we're thinking about, so what can we do in the medium term? Well, the hobby horse that we flog here at Energy Media, which is bitumen beyond combustion. And
Right.
we're going to have a show dedicated to that. I hope this week. I'm working on it now because we've been on this since like 2017. We've been reporting on this. I've interviewed all the scientists and so we've got a pretty good handle on it. And this year or probably next year, there will be a commercial process to turn bitumen into the precursor for carbon fiber manufacturing. So
Yeah.
announce, you say, look, if you guys are going to be, we can't, if we're having trouble building pipelines in a timely fashion, and it's politically almost impossible, and you guys down south don't want our stuff, okay, fine. We'll turn it into things instead of fuel. And we'll
Yeah.
make carbon fiber out of it. Or we'll make asphalt binder and so that you can build roads with it. Or we'll make activated carbon so you can make, battery anodes with it or whatever. There's a whole pile of stuff you can do, and we're very close. And again, it's a question of the government owns the research, it owns the intellectual property. And if it, called in the Alberta Innovates management and said, boys, we're in trouble. We're on a war footing with it. We have to have, it's not business as usual is done. Now we have to, now this is like a war footing. Get this done. Speed it up and let's get things to market and get building this industry. And then uh, Alberta Innovate says, hey, you know what? Once you only use 20% of the barrel to build, the heavy part of the barrel.
Hmm.
The rest of it is kind of light, maybe some is basically light oil. What then can you do with light oil? And we have a tremendous amount of research capacity in Alberta and figure that stuff out. Like, like
Yeah.
put the dollars in to do the science and then to get the innovations off the out of the lab onto the bench, off the bench into a demonstration project, into a pilot project, then commercialize it. But do it quicker, like
Well,
China.
I think what you're calling for is a real leader, someone to invest in it, someone to get this going.
Yes. Like somebody, we need a parade and we need somebody to stand up in front of the parade and say, I'm going to lead this thing. We got some ideas. And when we don't have ideas, we're going to come up with ideas. And then we're going to have a plan to implement those ideas. And man, we're going to go like Peter Lougheed did that.
Exactly.
And think back through Canadian history. How few leaders Canada has had who were like that?
Hmm.
There are not many. We are really the industry of, hewers of wood and drawers of water, and we let the incumbents, the utilities and the oil and gas companies run our policies and tell us what's good for us. We need a Peter Lougheed. Get away from that stuff. It's our resource. We'll decide what's the best strategy here, and we'll put the plan in place. You guys play your role. We're not unfriendly to industry, but why should we put industry in the driver's seat? Industry will just do what's good for industry, right?
Yeah.
It's not going to do
Yeah.
what's good for us. So, and we are the owner of the resource. So and you know what's really ironic here? This is a little aside. Okay, so when I was doing unethical oil part two, and which is about the oil and gas liability management system in conventional oil. In 1993, the government went to the the industry, and it said, we're the resource owner here. So here's a list of descending priorities for who owns an abandoned well. And at the bottom, and the place number 7 or something, was the government, the resource owner. So if there's just nobody left in the other 6 spots, well, who occupied the other 6 spots? It was mostly industry, right?
Yeah.
The company that developed the well initially, the company that bought the well from, the second. Anyway, and industry said, no way, man. Uh-uh. We're not going to do that. We'll look after it ourselves. My point here is that ownership of the resource implies, and it shouldn't just be an implication, it should be required, the resource owner be active in protecting the interests of the resource owners.
Right.
That's us, our interests. And did we not have Kevin Byrne on here saying Canada needs a more strategic approach to how it develops its oil and gas industry and how it resolves all of these questions?
Yeah.
We need to go back. We need to go back to the past to figure out some strategies on what to do with the future. And Peter Lougheed, God bless him, is is the model. And now the question is who's going to rise up and provide that kind of leadership? Because if we don't, we're going to get steamrolled by Trump 2.0,
Yeah.
and then we're going to be in big trouble. So,
Yeah.
okay, I promised we would do the second half of this. So let's take a look at that PowerPoint. Okay, just a little bit of remedial homework here. We've used these slides in a couple of other shows, but this is Canadian exports, which we export about 4 million barrels a day out of the 5 million barrels a day we produce as a country, and and this is where they go. So most of it is in the Midwest, and some of it is in the Gulf Coast, which is Pad 3, and some of it is in the Rocky Mountains and a little bit on the West Coast, primarily in California. So this when we export oil, it goes to these areas of the United States. And I should mention there is some disagreement about exactly how much is processed in the Midwest versus the Gulf Coast, because Kevin Byrne was on and saying that some of the U.S. Energy Information Administration counts it in the Midwest, but then it gets transshipped down to the coast, and so we're not quite clear how much all of that is. But anyway, we'll use the official data for our purposes today. Okay, next slide. And this will just give you some idea of the exports. So you can see Alberta overwhelmingly dominates the exports. The dark blue on the left-hand bars, that's heavy crude, and the light blue is light sweet crude. So you can see it's about 3.2 million barrels a day of heavy. Okay, the next one. Now we're going to get into quotes that I lifted from some of these transcripts. This one, PDF Energy, is a fairly small refiner. And I said reported by Argus Media. That's where I first found it. And then I went back and actually read the transcript. And in the transcripts I read, and I have to point this out, everybody is just confused. Everybody is flummoxed. Are we going to get tariffs or aren't we going to get tariffs? How will they be designed? How will they be applied? Uh,
Yeah.
what will be the percentage? Because Trump says 10% on Canada, 25% on Mexico. So if you've got if Mexican Maya is a sort of an equivalent grade to Canadian heavy, and but they have access to a coast. And so if the Americans price them out of the market in the U.S. Gulf Coast, Mexico can send those ships somewhere else. Kevin Byrne is fond of saying, if you put oil in a tanker, it will find a market someplace. It will just go to wherever it needs to go to sell that load. So the Mexicans have optionality. That's a big that the producers like that. Can I go pipeline? Can I go to the coast? Can I put it on a ship? Can I put it on rail? All of that is optionality. So if the Mexicans vacate their 600,000 barrels a day of Maya, out of the US Gulf Coast, can it be backfilled by Canadian producers? We don't know.
We have
We
no
don't.
idea.
We just don't know. That's how confusing this is. And each one of the executives that I'm going to talk about today said, "Look, man, we need to get the best advice we can, and then we need to see how it plays out." Okay. So what did Matt Lucy from PBF? And this is we should not take this lightly. He said, if they don't sell it to the U.S., it's going to stay in the ground. So we talked earlier about the curtailment of 325,000 barrels a day, what a big deal that was in Alberta. What happens if, because of Trump's tariffs, they lose 500,000 barrels a day or a million barrels a day? How much of a blow would that be to Alberta? It wouldn't be insignificant. And Lucy went on to say the tariffs would cause a sizable disruption and have some impact on throughput, by which he means there would be his refinery would probably produce about 10% less than it normally would. So that's his take on it. Let's have the next one because this is an interesting. Okay, so this is Marianne Manin, who's the CEO of Marathon Petroleum, which is the biggest refiner in the US. And this is really interesting because the question of that 10%, who's going to bear that? Now, I've read economists who say historically, consumers bear 100% of the cost of tariffs. They always get passed on, right? Well, Marianne Manin says no, it's going to mostly be borne by the producer and a little bit to the consumer. So, like maybe 75% to the producer in Canada or 25% to the consumer in the Midwestern market or the US Gulf Coast market or whatever, wherever it is. Not everybody agrees with her, but that's,
Hmm.
she carries some weight here because she's the CEO of the biggest refining company. Let's go on to the next slide. This is it wasn't clear, and I wasn't able to find it before we started the show, but Kevin Byrne was helping me out with some of the details here. And he said, their refining capacity at these six Midwest refineries is for Marathon is about 1 million barrels a day capacity. Okay. Not all of that is heavy crude. And we had been assuming that it was mostly heavy crude. Apparently it isn't, but we don't know what percentage is heavy. So I'm just going to assume, I think probably if we're in the half, the 50% range, we're kind of in the ballpark.
Hmm.
So here's what she said. We had assumed because they spent so much money installing cokers and reconfiguring the refinery for heavy crude that they would not want to switch back to light. That's not what she says. I would say a light switch within our system, we believe would have minimal impact. And because they are as big as they are, they spend a lot of time running scenarios and fine-tuning their logistics so that they can do this. So Marathon on those six key Midwest refineries has optimize their refinery so that yes, they can run heavy and it's cheap and they would love to do that. But if it's more economic for them to source US light sweet crude from the Bakken in North Dakota, from the Rocky Mountains, from the Utica in Ohio, and the Marcellus, they'll do that.
Right.
And so, how much demand would it be? All of the heavy crude? Would it be some of the heavy crude? Again, we don't know. But there's enough volume there that it could be a real blow to Alberta, just with what Marathon is talking about. Okay, let's go on to the next one. So this is Valero Energy, which is another big refiner in the U.S. And this is what their CEO Lane Riggs said on their earnings call. If you're a captive market, it will somehow get shared between the refinery and the Canadian crude producer because there's some captive markets in the mid-continent. So what he means is that those are refineries like PBF where they don't have the option of switching to light sweet. The cost is too high. They can't get access to light sweet crude. Whatever the reason is, they think they believe that they can't, and so they become a captive market for the Canadian heavy crude producer. And in that case, his opinion is that they'll share it. So Not that the refinery will pay a third and the other two will pay a third, but the producer and the the producer and the consumer will pay. So you can see the comments that we've got from these three executives very much reflect the confusion. But I think that once you they also talked, some of them have, refineries in the US Gulf Coast, they have some in California, other places. And it looks like, they have enough options that they could shrink the market for Canadian heavy crude in the US so that it would hurt. They
Yeah.
don't have to take all of it, or, they don't have to stop importing all of Alberta heavy, but they could stop importing enough that it would really hurt Alberta. And in now, some of the Canadian companies, I was reading a headline, Cenovus, for example, says that if that happens, they're going to look for Asian markets. And maybe they've got space on Trans Mountain expansion. They can get to Burnaby and then put it on a ship, and they'll look more for Asian markets. Fine. But I don't think that individual companies are going to have the flexibility to do this all on their own.
Right.
There's got to be a public component here. And as Kevin Byrne said, he said, look, anytime this comes up, you can bet there's going to be public taxpayers' dollar in it. And so if
Hmm.
taxpayers' dollars are going to be somehow used to create solutions here for this particular problem, whether it's in the short term or the medium term, whatever it is, then we as taxpayers ought to know what that strategy is, and
Hmm.
we should have some input into it. It shouldn't all be done behind closed doors, you know, over sipping scotch at the Calgary Petroleum Club. No, there needs to be a public conversation about this. And
Exactly.
industry doesn't like that. Industry like it likes to have stuff behind closed doors in boardrooms. But I think, and this is one of the reasons why Peter Lougheed was kind of shunned at the beginning. They don't like people messing in their business, right?
Hmm.
But if you're taking our money, we get a seat at the table or more than one seat. So too bad. We need to have a public conversation about this. So if next slide, if you would.
I mean, not to mention we own the resource as well.
Exactly right. Do you want to explain this slide, MC?
Yeah, so I mean, we've been talking a lot today about the lack of leadership. So, we're going to ask our listeners to take action today and share our episode by tagging the link on Twitter. So put a link to the show in your Twitter post and tag one of the leaders. We've put their Twitter handles down here. So tag the leader of your choice and ask a question and demand an answer. Ask them what the position is, what they think of this information, and what's the plan.
It's interesting when we did that show, kind of, and it was a mild criticism, really, of Mark Carney. A lot of people in our audience pushed back and said, well, it's a leadership campaign. That's not when you bring up all the big ideas and so on. Well, okay, fine, except that this is not business as usual. This is
Yeah.
not business. We have somebody, supposedly the most powerful man in the world, who wants to take away our sovereignty. This is not business as usual. We need to do things faster, smarter, and we need to be maybe in some ways more aggressive. All of that stuff, business as usual, out the window, in my opinion. So ask questions, demand answers. We deserve them. MC, until tomorrow, it's good seeing you again, and we'll see what kind of a response we get to our argument.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, take care.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks for watching the show. We are on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers and over 1 million views. If you're enjoying the content, give us a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for being part of our community.